Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Today, the US and China are at war. Well, not literally, not yet anyway, but a trade war is bad enough, and it seems to be hitting many economies around the world. So where will it end? Will China be forced to give in? Will the US decide it's not worth the hurt? Or will it just carry on for the rest of our lives? In any case, who is the winner and who is the loser? I've heard lots of people say nobody wins when there's a trade war on, but is that really the case? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. So there is this ongoing trade spat between China and the United States. The US has 25% tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese imports. China has responded with tariffs on $60 billion of American goods. Donald Trump may well step it up with more tariffs on the rest of China's exports to the United States. The US, of course, is banning Huawei. China may well ban FedEx. Nobody's talking. They're just sharing insults. China is saying if the US wants a fight, we will fight to the end. So, Steve Keen, I mean, you are a protectionist at heart, so you must think Donald Trump is doing the right thing here. It's going to create new jobs for US workers.
Well, there's something, I mean, I've always argued that the focus that economists have on efficiency and allocation of existing resources is just the wrong angle to attack capitalism from completely. And what really matters is investment and development of new resources. And when you look at the history of America itself, my good friend Michael Hudson has an excellent book called America's Protectionist Takeoff, pointing out that like many other countries, including, of course, China and Korea and Japan, and in its own way, Germany, countries industrialized first with either explicit or implicit trade barriers that meant that what would otherwise have to be imported from overseas, like, for example, America importing English steel, was no longer possible. So you had to build your own steel factories. And then with the economies of scale, as the American economy expanded as well, plus the pressure to be able to become competitive and, you know, export steel in the opposite direction at some stage, they all work. So does
that work just in industrial era, though, as you're industrializing? I mean, we're in a post-industrial era now. If you look at what Donald Trump's doing, I mean, he's imposing these tariffs. He's giving money to farmers to compensate farmers for the business that they're not getting. That's not exactly investing for the future, is it? That's just propping up the mistakes.
What's actually happening, and it's what's happening back in boardrooms that I'm interested in. And what you've had, I mean, you look at the way in which China developed, and this is why I look back on it, there was very, very fortunate sort of incidentals, not accidents, but happenstances in my life that decades ago I was involved in overseas aid. I was working as education officer for the Australian Freedom from Hunger campaign. And as part of that, my objective was to change Australia's mind about overseas aid. Well, you know, thank you very much for my budget. I think I got $40,000 a year to spend, including my salary. But what we did at one stage, we called Media Watch, which was looking at the coverage of the third world issues in the Australian media. Then we followed up with a broadcasting tribunal hearing, which is worth talking about in itself, my one exposure to Rupert Murdoch. But finally, I suggested the idea of running seminars between journalists of different countries, where we covered not just the daily news, which, of course, as you know, subbies and editors sit down and grab the rival newspapers. What did they get that we missed? That's the sort of event focus. And I said, we need issues oriented journalism. Gave a talk about it at a conference in Brisbane, which a woman in the audience walked up to me afterwards and said, I'm Jocelyn Shea. I'm the head of the Australia-China Council. I really like your ideas. We'd like you to use to do that for China. I said, yeah, sure. And then started flirting with somebody in the audience. Another story. And ignoring it until I got a letter from Jocelyn Shea saying she was going to finance me taking a group of Australian journalists to China. So I put together a year's coverage of Australia in the Chinese press, and they did the same. China in the Australian press, and they did the same in the reverse. We then sat down for 6 days, I think it was 4 or 6 days in Beijing during the trial of the Gang of Four, and discussed each other's comparative coverage, and then hopped in a set of Toyota Hilux buses and the old Soviet clone of the DC-3, flying around the country. And we went eventually to the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone as the concrete was being laid by CSR, Australian company, had an Aussie barbecue in the bottom of China at the time. And we then had the plans of the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone explained to us by probably the most intelligent people I met when I was in China. And their idea was there was this loophole in the American tariff laws that let American companies export components to a third world country, have them assembled or whatever else processed and sent back, and not pay tariff on the change in value in the meantime as a sort of subsidy to developing countries. And that's exactly what the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone was set up to exploit. And so far, it was nothing different to what I'd learned from other countries. Indonesia was running free trade zones. Malaysia was running free trade zones. They all had them. And they'd all fail ultimately because as the wages rose, as they would do ultimately with the extra pressure coming in from, employing all those workers in process jobs rather than working in agriculture, what China said as well, and every company has to have a Chinese partner when it starts, and no requirements.
And we sort of know all of that, and that has mushroomed.
No, you don't know part of it, mate. Unless I've told you already. That is, within 5 years, the Chinese partner had to own half the business.
Yeah. So, I mean, it did move quickly. But how is that China's fault? So it's got
not China's fault at all. It's been incredibly successable.
Yeah. And they've now got $400 billion trade surplus against the United States.
Yeah.
More fool America, I guess, for letting it happen.
Absolutely. Again, this is the typical story. American capitalists couldn't give a shit about the workers. So they got this offer of the only reason you'd accept giving half your business away is you've got to make an incredibly profit on the other half. So to actually say, yeah, okay, we'll start a business in the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone. We'll shut down what we're doing in Midwest America. We'll transfer it to Shenzhen. We'll pay the workers. You must be paying a pittance. And of course they were back in those days. We're talking 1981, 82. The monthly wage of a Chinese worker, process worker, was probably equivalent to the daily wage of an American. So they could afford to sacrifice half the profits because they were making such a killing on the wage costs. And that's exactly what the Rust Belt was, all these Americans being shut down, production moved offshore. That's what China took advantage of. And at the same time, they wanted to improve their engineering. So because the Chinese Communist Party is dominated by engineers, that was a major thing. We want this technology as rapidly as possible. And that was highly successful. So China's successfully industrialized. And now, of course, Trump is
the horses bolted.
The anger about it in America. Yeah.
And look, and if China did get more expensive, then there's always India, Pakistan, the Philippines, all those other places that the.
But the reason it's going to happen more slowly than it would from if they hadn't had half of the business becomes Chinese, then when it moved, it would have been foreign companies based in China moving to become foreign companies based in Vietnam. Now it's going to be Chinese companies setting off bases in Vietnam. And Chinese companies establishing work.
Well, it's cheaper for them.
It's cheaper for them, but the profit goes back to China now rather than going to America.
And there's a lot more to this discussion. If you want to hear it in full, then you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. And if you pledge $10 or more support each month, then you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series, as well as helping Steve with all of his economic research. Or you can subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Choose one of these subscription plans on the right-hand side of the webpage. I'm Phil Dobbie. We'll be back with another one of these fairly soon. Thanks for listening.